lots of the debate about like how to use like water. Rivers don't really figure as like anything very specific. It's kind of like a conduit that brings water from A to B, or it's kind of like overlook how deeply they are actually like needed for like human survival, meeting basic human needs. And how like not considering for those needs can actually lead to severe unintended consequences. If you think, for example, about the salmon fisheries in the Pacific Northwest, right, that were like totally decimated by the construction of dams that were used mostly to provide irrigation water to like Central Valley and like other places in California, right? And like at the same time, these dams totally destroyed like the salmon fisheries that actually provided affordable and nutritious food to like native populations. Food that was free before is now something that people need to pay for. And like making like the arch to some of my research that we've been doing on like fisheries in like Southeast Asia, thinking about like Laos or Cambodia. So they want to build like all these like hydropower dams to provide hydropower, which is relatively cheap, and to use it for like really useful things, like for like industrialization. So you build these like big dams, you create a lot of hydropower, but you take away this really important nutritional resource from people. The Mekong is, there's like also some really exciting research that highlights that, of course, people could start like farming like tilapia in the reservoirs that are created by these like hydropower dams, but this would not have at all the same nutritional value that the like native fish population that was like much more diverse. Big rivers, they don't transport only water, they also transport like all sorts of like other things. They also transport like sediment, right? So like sand and gravel and like other like things like that, right? And when those sediments hit the sea, they build these like big river deltas. For the Mekong, it's like a delta that has like nearly the size of the Netherlands, so very low elevation, just like a few meters above the sea level. Now there's this conflict again with like these like hydropower dams in the Mekong. We're basically building those dams, you create like an artificial reservoir, and like basically like the rivers bring in like water that's rich in sediment, and then if it hits like this kind of like stagnant reservoir, like all that sediment will basically settle out. Basically what happens naturally, I can imagine like these deltas are just kind of like enormous pile of sediment, right? So it's like like let's say like 5-10 kilometers like depth of like sediments. So like if you pile so much material on top of each other, it's kind of like compresses. Usually that's not a problem because you have like more sediment coming in. And now if you take away that sediment, and it's not only that the delta is sinking, as well as the sea levels are also rising, right? So you're taking away that nature-based solution, and now you end up with a situation where like the delta is going down, like the land surface going down, the sea levels are going up, right? So which leads to the effect that 95% of that Mekong delta could be like under the sea level by the end of the century. So why does it link to food security? It's just that these like river deltas are so fertile and so important. So I think for the Mekong, we did some very rough calculation, and I think 2 to 5% of all calories produced worldwide are actually coming from the Mekong Delta. Now the question is like, how do we navigate those trade-offs? And I think the key aspect here is that we need to be pretty strategic about like how we approach those trade-offs. My research tried to like analyze these different options before you actually start bringing out the concrete trucks and the movers and start building dams. But just doing it a priori, so at least the decision makers, at least they can make a decision. They can be like, okay, we're going to build like dams in this way, and we know that there's going to provide a certain amount of hydropower, but we are also aware that there are like impacts on like livelihoods and like fisheries and like sediment and so on. What's happening right now is like much more, we just build like the dam that's most convenient, cheapest, for example, just in terms of construction costs. And then we think about the like system scale consequence later, right? This is kind of like what my research tries to do. So it does it for rivers, but it also does it like for like fertilizer, right? Let's say you go to like sub-Saharan Africa where like crop yields are really low, right? Of course you could go there and just apply like maximum like fertilizer like everywhere, right? And then this would probably be really terrible for water quality. But probably you also want to explore some like intermediate solutions where probably you don't apply like the full rate of fertilizer. You like implement some policies for like buffer strips along the rivers, and probably you produce a little bit less food than if you just went like full on like fertilizer wise. But after all, you might find like a much better trade-off between these kind of like conflicting objectives. Like, in a way, I think it's really this kind of like consideration of these like multiple aspects, right? And like considering that like like nutrition is really important for for like, like health and, like people obviously, right? But it doesn't really stand alone, right? And it's like so closely interlinked, like so like many different sectors, right? To like human sectors, but also to like ecosystems and global mega trends like climate change, for example, right? And I think like where the innovation really comes in is like just starting to build these like numerical modeling frameworks that really like enable us to like look at like many different futures and see which of them are desirable and which are not, and like hopefully steer like decision making investments to like it's more likely to lead to desirable outcomes.